Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the Euthyphro Dilemma, which is often offered by atheists as an argument against a theistic-based morality or against the sort of moral argument for God's existence. And before we get started, I want to thank the YouTuber TheologicalDissent for the video idea. To get started, the Euthyphro Dilemma is found in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, quote, "Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods?" Put in a more modern context, Leibniz, the calculus guy and the father of computer science, famously asked, is goodness and justice, quote, good and just because God wills it, or does God will it because it is good and just? And hopefully you can see the force of this dilemma. If we take the first horn of this dilemma, God wills something because it is good, then there is a standard of good independent of God. And this ends up calling into question God's sovereignty and omnipotence. It makes it seem like there's a standard of goodness outside of God that God must adhere to. However, if we take the second horn of the dilemma, basically saying whatever God wills is good, then this appears to make good arbitrary. God could will genocide or murdering children, and this would be good. And this isn't just an abstract notion either, right? In the Bible, we have instances of God seeming to command Jacob to sacrifice his son Isaac, or God apparently commanding the slaughter of the Canaanites. If we take this horn of the dilemma, it seems as though what is good can just change on a whim or based on God's whims. So this appears to put the theist in a tough spot because either of these horns seems unacceptable, at least to me. I mean, should we then conclude that the idea of a God-ordained morality doesn't make any sense? Well, before doing this, let's first see what Christian thinkers and other theists have said over the past 2 millennia. And additionally, it's worth noting that Plato, the author of Euthyphro, was a theist who wrote that there was one supreme God who was, quote, in every way perfect. And furthermore, many philosophers believe Socrates was a theist as well. Now, while Socrates was accused of atheism because he did not believe in the city's gods, in the Apology, we have him saying, quote, "For each time those present think I am wise in these things, in which I refute others. But the fact is, men, in reality, God is wise." Socrates has a somewhat confusing habit of switching between the term God and gods, which actually leads many scholars to conclude that Socrates believed in one superior God, even though he didn't believe in the city's gods there in Athens. So if those putting forward the dilemma were theists, perhaps they can offer a solution to the dilemma itself. Now, some people are going to say Plato and Socrates only saw the Euthyphro dilemma as a problem for polytheism and not monotheism. And while this may be true, on the surface, this doesn't really solve the overall problem of Euthyphro, because to me it seems like we can formulate the dilemma against a monotheistic God too. What I think is a much better answer for why Plato didn't find this argument all that convincing against theism generally is found in his metaphysics. See, Plato thought that the physical world, or what we see, was not as real as the world of forms, which is non-physical, timeless, and sort of absolute. And this is shown in his analogy of the cave, where we only see shadows of what things actually are. Plato famously developed the idea of the form of the good, or perhaps better translated as the idea of the good, which basically to Plato was the ultimate source of all goodness, truth, and knowledge. And this was the highest form, the source of all other forms, and perfect, eternal, and changeless. Now remember that Plato also believed in one supreme, transcendent, and perfect God that was all-knowing and all-powerful. This God is perfect, changeless, and outside of time, using forms to build the universe. So this begs the question, is there a connection here? Now, it isn't clear to me, at least, if Plato saw this supreme God and the form of the good as the same thing, but later thinkers like Plotinus certainly did. So when Jews and Christians came across these ideas, they were basically like, hey, wait a minute, this sounds a lot like God. And there's clearly a lot of points of agreement here, and this was not lost on early Christians like Justin Martyr, who famously wrote, quote, "The gospel and the best elements in Plato and the Stoics are almost identical ways of apprehending the same truth." Identifying the Christian God with the form of the good or goodness itself is why the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't bother most Christian thinkers throughout history, from St. Augustine to St. Anselm to Thomas Aquinas. If God is goodness or the source of goodness itself, then the question, is God good or is what God wills good, ends up basically just reducing to, is good good? And if we follow Aristotle's logic, in particular the law of identity, this statement is true. In fact, it's a tautology. So no dilemma, no problem. Now, what's important to note here, and I'm borrowing from Frege on this occasion, is what is meant by these words may refer to different ideas that in the end are actually the same thing. For instance, I can ask the question, is the morning star equal to the evening star? And while this question does reduce to a tautology because the referent in each of these sentences is the same object, the sense of each of these words is different. What mental image comes to mind or what idea comes to mind when I'm saying them. So as a result, asking is what God's will's good may not reduce to a tautology if what I mean by the word good is something else. But in the end, the Christian may just simply say this is an epistemic limitation, not an ontological one. In other words, to the Christian, God is good, meaning God is the form of the good and the source of the good. Whether people recognize this or acknowledge this is beside the point. The ball is then in the atheist's court to explain what is so problematic about God being identified with goodness itself. After all, as many philosophers have argued, the entire Euthyphro Dilemma rests on an assumption that goodness and God's will are distinct. If they are not distinct, something theists have argued throughout history, before the time of Christ actually, the whole thing kind of falls apart and both horns of the dilemma become incoherent. Now, one objection I've heard from Wes Morriston, who I should mention is a Christian on at least some days, is that this could appear to make God's commands based on a whim. He writes, quote, God's commands are, from the moral point of view at least, completely arbitrary and we have no obligation to obey them. And this is one of those objections that maybe sounds pretty good on the surface and then kind of dissolves the more you think about it. I mean, it bothered me for maybe a day and then I kind of realized it was a bit of a trick. The problem with this objection is that it's kind of deceptive about the word arbitrary. Now, Morriston unfortunately never defines his usage of the word arbitrary in his paper, and my guess is if he did, perhaps he would spot the issue with this article. So let's try to do so. Merriam-Webster defines arbitrary as existing or coming about seemingly at random or by chance or as a capricious and unreasonable act of will. Well, if God's nature is good, then it isn't random or capricious. And God being reasonable or the source of all reason and truth and being and all that good stuff, he's not going to be unreasonable or issue commands outside of his nature. If God is the source of reason, then his acts of will cannot be unreasonable or capricious. So it's difficult for me to see what the problem here is. Now, perhaps the question that Morriston means to bring up is whether God could have been any other way. Does God have the freedom not to be good? But again, this would beg the question that God's will is separate from goodness. Now, to be fair, what I initially found compelling about Morriston's point was the idea that God's will is goodness seems to make the idea of goodness subjective to God. But we need to be careful what we mean by subjective. If God is a personal being, then yes, what is good is indeed subject to God. But so is everything else. All truth, beauty, goodness, whether anything else exists besides God and what does exist, all of this is subjective to God. So the word subjective kind of loses its meaning here. Let's expand upon this idea of subjectivity a little bit. Most of us would say that my taste in food is more subjective than the way nature behaves. And the idea here is that we think nature would follow the same course of action regardless of whether someone perceives it or not. Whether someone believes or wants it to behave a certain way or not, it's still going to behave the same. One's taste in food, on the other hand, depends upon one's preference and their perception of it. Food wouldn't taste good without a subject there to perceive it as tasting one way or another. Since the existence of these feelings depend on who is perceiving it and their preferences, we say taste in food is subjective, or at least more subjective than ultimate reality or the way nature behaves. However, when it comes to a theistic God, who is being to its maximal degree, the way nature behaves is also subject to God's preferences and goals. God's omnipotence means he has the power to actualize any state of affairs, and his will dictates which of those states are going to be actualized. So morality, reality, and indeed anything we would call truth itself, of course supposing we believe truth exists and there's a reality outside of our own feelings and thoughts, are all contingent upon God's will and thus subjective in a certain way. So in this case, it doesn't make sense to say that morality is somehow more subjective than anything else we accept as true or factual simply because it depends on God's will. Anything that exists outside of God is contingent upon God's will. With this in mind, let's return to the Euthyphro Dilemma. Is what is good good because God wills it, or does God will it because it is good? And the solution here, following Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, is to say that it's a false dilemma. There's a third option. God's very nature is goodness itself. God does not will something because such a thing is good outside of himself, nor is what is good simply because God says it is and it's arbitrary. Rather, God wills what is good because he is good, because he is the source of goodness itself. Now, an atheist can, maybe perhaps rightly, ask something like, if God commanded you to murder your child, would that make it good? And the standard knee-jerk response from a theist to say, well, he wouldn't do that, is actually the right answer from what I can see. God doesn't just change his mind for no reason, nor would he command something inconsistent with his unchanging will and nature. Now, does this limit God's power? I don't see how. Someone may try to propose the counterfactual: if God's will was different, could he command something else? However, if God is pure act, the way Aquinas argued, then this is an impossible antecedent. There's no possibility around a being that is pure actuality. Consider a new mother or father. Does it limit their power if they wouldn't ever murder their newborn despite having the power in principle to do so? It's hard for me to see why. As a result, it may be more helpful to think of God's omnipotence as involving the power to actualize any state of affairs he desires rather than simply anything at all. If God has the power to create any state of affairs consistent with his will, then the existence of any state of affairs inconsistent with his will either undermines his omnipotence or will. A state of affairs that exists that differs from the will of an omnipotent being is a logical contradiction. What is disappointing in all of this is I've seen many atheists miss the point on this, including many prominent ones. For instance, the 2007 Cambridge Companion to Atheism has an article on God and morality. This article doesn't engage with any of the points discussed here, but rather only attacks a view that God arbitrarily makes up moral values, a view I've quite frankly never seen anyone seriously defend. Again, we need to be really careful around words like arbitrary and subjective. Now, granted, there are plenty of other theological issues that come up here, such as making sense of some of the commandments we see in the Old Testament. But my goal here is not to dive into these issues. Rather, it is to talk about the Euthyphro Dilemma with regards to theism, or at least Christian theism in general, not to defend certain interpretations of the Old Testament. And there are two reasons for this. The first is I'm not a biblical historian, and how to interpret passages in the Old Testament is not really my field of expertise. Someone could follow my argument here while thinking the Old Testament is mostly fairy tales. The second reason is that many Christians really do differ in their interpretation of some of these difficult passages. So as to make this argument as general as possible, I'm not tackling this topic, at least not here. The reason I believe in God has much less to do with a specific interpretation of the Old Testament and much more to do with the combination of reason and personal experience. So instead, I'll point you to Paul Copan and Randall Rouser, both of whom have different views for more on this. They're both infinitely more qualified than I am to talk about the exegetical side. Now let's try to answer a few pressing questions a skeptic or seeker may have about this response. Does God have free will? The answer to this is yes, in the sense that God makes choices without any external constraints or coercion. But this kind of free will is indeed different than our own. For instance, we have the freedom to lie. Is God free to lie? No. Now, some may argue this infringes upon God's freedom, but this doesn't because it's not an external constraint that dictates God cannot lie. Rather, it's God's own nature and perfection. His inability to lie comes from an intrinsic part of his own character. Put another way, God cannot be unfaithful to himself, he cannot break his word, he cannot be less than perfect. A lesser being can choose to sin, but God cannot, or he would not be God. Now let's talk about God's will. Is God free to want to lie? To be honest, I don't know, and this probably depends on what we mean by the word free. But here I would argue no as well. God is not free to want to sin. Now, why is this? Because I, following many other theologians, define sin as the absence of good or a privation of good. Put another way, sin is a direction away from God or God's will. In other words, it's impossible for God to be or want to be anything other than God himself. But again, this is not an external limitation, since sin is simply that which turns us away from God. I don't see how God can turn away from himself. If you've seen my video on various theodicies, you'll see how various thinkers like St. Augustine define sin as the absence of good. And my view is similar on this based on linear algebra, right? Consider God as a point in n-dimensional space. Us choosing to do good is us changing our will in such a way that it points in the direction towards God. So imagine a vector here pointing towards God. Sin, on the other hand, is a voluntary act that involves going against God. So imagine a vector that points away from this point that we call God. Since God is the source of good, he does not have a choice to sin. But this doesn't create a problem because he is that point from which goodness is defined. To argue otherwise is to argue against the law of identity, one of the three laws of thought found in first-order classical logic. As a result, it doesn't really make sense to judge God's character by any external standard because such a standard would be arbitrary. God's nature is the very standard of good properly understood. I'd go so far as to argue any alternative proposal for such a standard would be arbitrary, but I'll save that for another video. Of course, someone could say God's nature is X, but I personally prefer Y. But then the question becomes, where does our standard come from? It's kind of like saying, look, sound intensity tends to follow an inverse square law, but I'd prefer it to follow an inverse cube law. At a certain point, someone's probably going to say, so what? Now, there could be times someone could question God's actions and whether such actions are consistent with God's own standard, but again, that's going to be another question. And in my view, most of us seem at least somewhat inclined to follow the kinds of things that God commands, which are, of course, expressions of his will. Most of us do care about justice and fairness. We want equality, we desire forgiveness when we mess up, and many of us believe in love and kindness and these sorts of things, right? We think truthfulness is somehow greater than lying, even if we struggle to give the most rational and coherent account of it. As a Christian theist, I'd argue such inclinations are divine reflections. As Paul mentions in Romans 2:14, non-Jews and non-Christians can still obviously do good things, even if they don't explicitly know or acknowledge what the source of goodness is. As one biblical commentator wrote, quote, "The very possibility of us doing good is evidence of an innate moral sense in the human heart, which, however it may often be obscured or perverted, remains as a characteristic of humanity and is more or less operative in all communities. Us doing good is us following God's will, which of course is his character." To wrap up, let's return to the question. Does God will, or in some formulations, command what he does because it is good, or is it good because he commands it? In this video, I've attempted to show that it's a false dilemma, and there's a third option that's far more satisfying. Goodness is God's will. In other words, both horns are incoherent, and the dilemma is fallacious because each horn assumes God and the good are distinct. Classical theists, including most Christians throughout history, reject that such a distinction exists, and hence respond with the view I've defended here. However, there are Christians who have sided with each of these horns, so let's go through each of these briefly. Those who take horn 1 are often moral Platonists. This includes people like the scholastic philosopher Gabriel Vasquez, who thought that there were obligations that existed prior to anyone's will, including God. Vasquez seems to have thought that God was obligated to follow certain obligations just like us. Of course, in that case, the moral argument for God's existence would fail because presumably moral obligations would exist independently of God. Richard Swinburne is a very good philosopher who also takes this horn of the dilemma, though his view is a bit more complicated and involves a distinction between necessary and contingent moral truths that's beyond the scope of this video. Also, there's been a renowned interest in horn 2 of this dilemma, which often falls under the name of divine command theory. You can check out work by David Baggett and John Hare, two competent philosophers who defend this view. John Hare is actually the son of the famous moral philosopher R.M. Hare, who I had to read as an undergraduate, though I think John Hare is able to articulate a much more coherent moral philosophy than his father. And John Hare wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on religion and morality, which I'll link in the references. Those who view the Euthyphro Dilemma as a false one has its basis all the way back to the Hebrew prophets. And as a result, this view is commonplace in Jewish thought as well, with the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writing in 2005, quote, "In Judaism, the Euthyphro Dilemma does not exist," and many others criticizing it as misleading and non-exhaustive. Thinkers like William Lane Craig, Thomas Aquinas, Ed Feser, and William James are all people that argue it's a false dilemma. So anyways, hopefully this sheds some light on the Euthyphro Dilemma and why I don't think it works as a serious challenge to Christian theism or theism in general. And you can check the references here for more info on this. One last thing I'll say is even if the Euthyphro Dilemma somehow debunks the moral argument for God, this doesn't mean the other arguments for God don't have any force or don't work either. It would just undermine the moral argument, though I don't see quite how that would work. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.